On New Year's Day, in the quiet suburb of Encinitas, California, police were called to investigate what appeared to be a routine welfare check. The address, a modest home on a peaceful street, looked like any other, with a neatly trimmed lawn and a driveway partially hidden by a stack of trash bags. But what officers would uncover beneath those bags was anything but routine. It was a scene that would spark headlines, court battles, and haunt a community long after the investigation was closed. What appeared to be an accidental death would unravel into a story of betrayal, trauma, and ultimately murder. Before we go into the details of the story, please note that this video contains true crime content, including themes of violence and betrayal, which some viewers may find distressing. While the events are based on a real case, some names and details have been altered to protect the privacy of those involved. This content is intended for educational and informational purposes, helping to explore the complexities of justice and human behavior. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. The victim was Kevin Rollins, a 64-year-old local philanthropist and the co-founder of a renowned butterfly conservation group. Known for his passion for environmental work and his charisma, Kevin was beloved by his community. He had spent years working to protect fragile ecosystems and promote education on butterfly species. By all accounts, he was a respected, accomplished man, a figure of stability and good intentions. But his legacy would soon be overshadowed by the disturbing secrets that surfaced after his death. When officers peeled back the layers of garbage that covered Kevin's body, they were confronted with undeniable signs of foul play. Kevin's lifeless form bore no signs of natural death. There were bruises around his neck, and his body had been hastily covered, as if someone had tried to conceal what had happened. This was no accident. Kevin Rollins, the man celebrated for his environmental work, had been murdered. As investigators began to piece together the events that led to Kevin's death, they turned their focus to someone who had been a significant part of his life: Araceli Kerr, his 36-year-old stepdaughter. Araceli was an accomplished interior designer, known for her meticulous work and vibrant personality. To outsiders, her relationship with Kevin appeared close, even affectionate. He had been in her life since she was a teenager, taking on the role of a father figure after her mother remarried. But behind closed doors, their relationship was far from perfect. What investigators would uncover was a devastating secret, a discovery that would shatter Araceli's world and drive her to commit the unthinkable. How does a relationship that seemed so loving turn into a motive for murder? And what could Araceli have found that would push her to such a breaking point? To answer those questions, we have to go back to the weeks leading up to Kevin's death, to a discovery so sickening, so gut-wrenching, that it would set off a chain of events no one could stop. To understand what led to the tragic events of New Year's Day, we must first understand the lives of the people involved. At the center of this story is Araceli Kerr, a woman whose world was shaped by both love and loss. Born and raised in Southern California, Araceli's early years were marked by a sense of normalcy. She grew up in a modest but happy household with her mother, Princess Yates, and her father, Anderson Browning. Her parents worked hard to give her a good life. Anderson, a soft-spoken accountant, provided a steady hand, while Princess, a warm and nurturing woman, was the heart of their home. Together, they built a childhood for Araceli that was stable, filled with laughter, and grounded in love. But that stability was shattered when tragedy struck the family. Araceli was just 13 years old when her father unexpectedly passed away from a heart attack. Losing Anderson was devastating for both mother and daughter. For Princess, it meant the end of her life with the man she loved. For Araceli, it meant losing her protector and the man she'd looked up to most. In the years that followed, the two tried to move forward together, but the loss left a void neither could fill. It wasn't until Araceli was 16 that her mother found love again, this time with Kevin Rollins, a man who seemed to offer the stability and care their family had been missing. Kevin, a man in his early 40s at the time, was charming, intelligent, and driven. He ran a well-known butterfly conservation nonprofit and was a familiar face in the community. Princess and Kevin married less than a year after meeting, and Kevin quickly assumed the role of stepfather to Araceli. To the outside world, Kevin appeared to be a devoted husband and a doting stepfather. He went out of his way to make Araceli feel supported. He attended her school events, offered advice about her future, and even helped with her college applications. By all accounts, he was the perfect addition to their family. To Araceli, Kevin became more than just a stepfather. He became a mentor, a confidant, and, at least in her teenage years, someone she trusted. But even as their bond seemed strong, subtle cracks in the foundation of their relationship began to appear over the years. Araceli, growing into adulthood, began to notice a shift in Kevin's behavior. Though he remained outwardly supportive, his attention at times felt unusual. Small, fleeting moments began to raise questions in her mind. An inappropriate comment about her appearance, a lingering glance that made her uneasy, or a sudden change in mood that seemed to have no explanation. These moments were fleeting enough for her to brush aside, but they lingered in her subconscious. Despite these small but unsettling moments, Araceli continued to lean on Kevin during her early adult years. When she began pursuing her passion for interior design, Kevin encouraged her, helping her network and even offering to connect her with some of his acquaintances in the nonprofit world. Araceli graduated with a degree in design and built a successful career, earning a reputation for her keen eye and innovative work. Through it all, Kevin remained a constant presence in her life, and though their relationship had its complications, Araceli remained grateful for the role he had played in her life after her father's death. To the world, Kevin Rollins was a man of many accomplishments. He was the co-founder of Butterfly Haven, a nonprofit organization dedicated to the conservation of endangered butterfly species. Under his leadership, Butterfly Haven became a pillar of the community, hosting educational programs for local schools, organizing fundraisers, and spearheading conservation efforts across the state. Kevin was admired for his passion and commitment to his work. He had a way with people, effortlessly charming anyone he met. His generosity and enthusiasm earned him respect and admiration, and his name became synonymous with environmental activism in the Encinitas area. Friends and colleagues described Kevin as charismatic and selfless. He was the type of person who could light up a room with his stories and make everyone feel at ease. He was generous with his time, often mentoring younger conservationists and offering guidance to those who wanted to follow in his footsteps. Kevin seemed, on the surface, to be the ideal community leader, someone who had dedicated his life to making the world a better place. But behind the charm and the accolades, there were whispers of a different side to Kevin Rollins, a side that few people knew about and even fewer dared to speak of. Stories from those who had worked closely with him painted a more complex picture of the man behind the public persona. There were reports of inappropriate comments directed at female colleagues, awkward interactions that left people feeling uncomfortable, and a temper that occasionally surfaced when things didn't go his way. Though these incidents were rare, they left a lasting impression on those who witnessed them. One former colleague, who spoke anonymously, described Kevin as a man who hid his flaws well. She recalled an incident during a fundraiser when Kevin made an offhand comment about a young intern's appearance, brushing it off as a joke when others seemed uncomfortable. Another person, a friend of the family, mentioned that Kevin had a tendency to hover around certain people, often finding excuses to insert himself into conversations that didn't involve him. These moments, though small, began to form a pattern, one that would take on much greater significance in the aftermath of his death. Kevin's troubled side, however, wasn't limited to his interactions with colleagues or acquaintances. As investigators would later learn, Kevin's private life held darker secrets. Secrets that would eventually lead to his murder. The same man who had built a reputation as a conservationist and mentor was also a man who harbored impulses that would shatter the trust of those closest to him. Araceli, the stepdaughter he had helped raise, would come to see Kevin not as the supportive father figure she had once believed him to be, but as someone who had betrayed her in ways she could never have imagined. As Araceli Kerr transitioned from a teenager to a young adult, her relationship with Kevin Rollins began to change. What had once been a bond built on trust and support now felt more complicated, more uneasy. At first, these shifts were subtle. Kevin's once encouraging words of advice occasionally carried an undertone that made Araceli pause. His compliments, which once felt fatherly, began to stray into uncomfortable territory. A remark about how beautiful she looked in a dress, or a lingering gaze that made her skin crawl. Small moments that she told herself were nothing, but left a growing knot in the pit of her stomach. Araceli often tried to rationalize these feelings. Kevin was her stepfather, the man who had supported her through so much. She reminded herself of how much he had done for her, helping her with her studies, guiding her through her career, and stepping into the role of a father figure after Anderson's death. She convinced herself that her discomfort was all in her head. After all, Kevin was known to be warm and personable with everyone. Perhaps he was just overly familiar, and she was misinterpreting his actions. But as the years went on, those feelings of unease began to grow. Kevin's behavior started to shift in ways that were harder to dismiss. He seemed to go out of his way to spend time alone with Araceli, often offering to help her with projects or insisting they have father-daughter dinners when her mother was away. He became more intrusive, asking personal questions about her dating life, her insecurities, and even her body, questions that felt inappropriate and invasive. The playful, easygoing relationship they had once shared was now shadowed by an undercurrent of tension that Araceli couldn't quite put into words. At family gatherings, Kevin's interactions with Araceli began to draw attention. Friends and relatives noticed the way he hovered near her, finding reasons to be close to her or touching her shoulder just a little too long. One family friend would later recall, "It wasn't anything overt, but it felt off. You could tell something was making her uncomfortable." And yet, despite her growing discomfort, Araceli felt trapped. She didn't want to cause a rift in her family, especially not between her mother and Kevin. She swallowed her unease, avoiding confrontation and hoping that whatever was making her feel this way would eventually fade. But it didn't fade. In fact, it only grew worse. Kevin's behavior became increasingly intrusive as time went on. There were moments that Araceli couldn't ignore, like the time he accidentally walked into her room without knocking while she was changing, brushing it off as a mistake. Or the night she caught him staring at her for a beat too long after she came home from an event dressed in an evening gown. These moments lingered in her mind, haunting her as she tried to maintain some sense of normalcy. What Araceli didn't know, what she couldn't have imagined, was that these small, unsettling interactions were only the surface of something much darker. Kevin's actions were more than just awkward or inappropriate. There was a secret he was hiding, one that would eventually destroy the fragile foundation of their relationship. And when Araceli discovered that secret, it would set her life on an irreversible course toward tragedy. The events that would lead to Kevin Rollins's death began in late December 2020. By this time, Kevin was no longer the vibrant, charismatic figure that many in the community had known. His health had been declining steadily over the years, the result of chronic back pain and other physical ailments that had taken their toll on him. On one particular December evening, Kevin suffered a fall in his home that left him hospitalized. For Kevin, it was a minor injury, but one that would set into motion a chain of events far more serious than he could ever have anticipated. With Kevin admitted to the hospital, Araceli Kerr stepped in to help. As his stepdaughter, she had long been the person he turned to when he needed assistance. Araceli visited Kevin in the hospital and assured him she would take care of things at home while he recovered. She promised to tidy up the house, manage his paperwork, and ensure everything was in order. At the time, Araceli believed she was simply doing her duty as a daughter, offering support to the man who had played such a pivotal role in her life. But what she didn't know was that her decision to help would uncover a secret that would forever shatter her perception of Kevin Rollins. In the days that followed, Araceli began the task of sorting through Kevin's home. She worked tirelessly to organize his papers, clean his space, and ensure he could return to a comfortable and well-maintained environment. As she moved from room to room, she couldn't help but notice how disorganized Kevin's belongings had become over the years. It was clear he had been struggling to manage certain aspects of his life. His once meticulously kept office was now cluttered with papers, mail, and various electronic devices. It was during one of these cleaning sessions that Araceli stumbled upon Kevin's laptop, tucked away in his home office. The device was closed, sitting atop a pile of papers. At first, she didn't think much of it. Kevin had always been technologically savvy, using his laptop frequently for his work with Butterfly Haven. But as she picked up the laptop, she felt a sudden urge to check it. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was an instinctual feeling, whatever it was, Araceli decided to open the laptop. She told herself she was simply looking for documents or files related to Kevin's nonprofit work, something she could help him sort through while he recovered. What she found, however, was far beyond anything she could have imagined. The laptop screen flickered to life as Araceli opened it, and Kevin's desktop appeared. At first glance, everything seemed normal. Folders neatly labeled with names like Butterfly Haven Reports and 2020 Taxes. But as she clicked around, her eye was drawn to a folder buried deep in the directory. Its name was unassuming, something generic, like photos or miscellaneous. There was nothing about it that should have raised suspicion, yet Araceli felt compelled to click. And when she did, her world came crashing down. Inside the folder, she found subfolders, dozens of them, each meticulously labeled with descriptions that turned her stomach. These weren't just photos. They were categorized by body parts, legs, arms, chest, and more. Araceli's hands trembled as she opened the first folder, and what she saw made her stomach churn. The photos weren't of strangers. They were of her. Photos of herself. Photos she had no memory of Kevin ever taking. With her heart pounding, Araceli began scrolling through the images. They showed her at various ages, some from recent years, others from when she was just a teenager. Some were of her in the shower, taken through a fogged glass door. Others were more intimate, showing her in vulnerable, private moments. Among them were even pictures she had taken consensually years ago with a boyfriend, images she had assumed were long deleted. Somehow, Kevin had obtained these photos and saved them, meticulously organizing them into folders on his laptop. The sense of violation Araceli felt in that moment was indescribable. In later testimony, Araceli would struggle to put her emotions into words. "I felt violated, gutted," she told the court. "Like I couldn't even recognize my own skin. It was the most violating, awful, gut-wrenching feeling ever. I felt sick, like I was going to throw up. I couldn't breathe." She would describe how her mind raced in that moment. How the man she had trusted for so many years, the man who had played the role of her father, had betrayed her in a way she never thought possible. It wasn't just the photos themselves that horrified her. It was the realization of how long Kevin had been hiding this from her, how deeply he had violated her trust, and how much of her life he had secretly been watching and recording. Araceli sat frozen at Kevin's desk, unable to move, unable to comprehend the magnitude of what she had just uncovered. Her mind raced with questions. How long had he been doing this? How had he gotten those intimate photos? And, most terrifyingly, what else had he done that she didn't know about? It was a moment that would alter her life forever. A moment where her perception of Kevin Rollins shifted from that of a loving stepfather to something far more sinister. As Araceli closed the laptop, she was overcome with a mix of emotions. Disgust, betrayal, and an all-consuming anger that began to take hold of her. In that moment, she made a decision, one that would set her on a path she couldn't turn back from. Kevin Rollins had stolen something from her that she could never get back, and she was determined to make him pay for it. After making the horrifying discovery on Kevin's laptop, Araceli Kerr was overcome by a tidal wave of emotions she couldn't contain. Anger, disgust, betrayal, and disbelief all swirled within her, each one threatening to drown her. She replayed the images in her mind, no matter how much she wished she could forget them. She thought of all the years she had trusted Kevin, the man who had been in her life since she was a teenager, the man who had posed as a loving stepfather while secretly violating her in the worst way possible. The realization was too much to bear. That night, Araceli sat alone in her apartment, shaking with anger and revulsion. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't eat. She felt physically ill, her stomach churning every time her mind returned to the photos. Every memory she had of Kevin, every smile, every gesture of support, was now tainted. The man she had once admired, who had stepped into her life after the loss of her father, was now a monster in her eyes. She paced her living room, trying to make sense of it all, but there was no explanation that could justify what Kevin had done. Unable to hold it in any longer, Araceli picked up the phone and called her mother, Princess Yates. She didn't know how to tell her, how to put the depth of Kevin's betrayal into words, but she had to say something. The conversation began calmly, but as Araceli tried to explain what she had found, her voice cracked under the weight of her emotions. Her mother, stunned and confused, struggled to process what she was hearing. "Are you sure?" Princess asked repeatedly, her voice trembling. Araceli screamed into the phone, her anger boiling over. "Yes, I'm sure. He had photos of me. Of me. From when I was a kid. How can you even ask me that?" Princess, caught between disbelief and denial, tried to calm Araceli down. "We need to think this through," she said. "Maybe there's an explanation." But her words only enraged Araceli further. An explanation? What kind of explanation could there possibly be? She hung up the phone, tears streaming down her face. The woman who had always been her greatest source of comfort was now someone she couldn't turn to, and Araceli felt more alone than ever. Desperate for support, she turned to her closest friend, Jaylene Newman. Jaylene had always been her confidant, the person who had seen her through heartbreaks, challenges, and triumphs. When Araceli arrived at Jaylene's house that night, her friend immediately knew something was wrong. Araceli was pale, her eyes swollen from crying, her voice shaky as she tried to explain what she had uncovered. Jaylene listened in shock, her face frozen in disbelief as Araceli described the photos. "How could he do this to you?" Jaylene asked, her voice breaking. But despite her words of sympathy, there was nothing she could say to console Araceli. Nothing could erase the images or the betrayal that had taken root in her heart. As the hours passed, Jaylene tried to talk Araceli down, to get her to see reason. She suggested going to the police, seeking legal action, finding some way to hold Kevin accountable. But to Araceli, none of these options felt sufficient. Her anger was too raw, too consuming. "You don't understand," she told Jaylene. "This isn't something I can just let go. He doesn't deserve to walk away from this." And as she left Jaylene's house in the early hours of the morning, one thing had become clear. Araceli's mind was racing toward a dark and irreversible decision. In the days that followed, Araceli's anger began to transform into something far more dangerous: determination. The betrayal she had suffered consumed her, and she couldn't see a way forward without holding Kevin accountable in the most personal way possible. She kept the discovery a secret from everyone except her closest circle. But even among friends, her emotions began to spill out in ways that were impossible to ignore. She began texting her closest confidants, each message dripping with the rage and despair that now defined her. To her friend Daniela Stevens, Araceli wrote, "I don't know how to live knowing he did this." Her text was followed minutes later by another. "He has to pay for this." The messages were blunt, angry, and filled with the raw pain she was carrying. Daniela, alarmed by the intensity of Araceli's words, tried to calm her down, urging her to focus on the future and not let her anger consume her. But Araceli didn't respond. Her silence was louder than any reply. By the end of December, Araceli's thoughts had begun to crystallize into a plan. Though she hadn't shared the full extent of what she was contemplating, her messages hinted at a sense of resolve. She started making subtle inquiries, asking questions about medications, substances, and methods of incapacitation. Each conversation was couched in vague terms, but the pattern was clear. Araceli wasn't thinking about justice. She was thinking about revenge. The final days of the year were a blur for Araceli. She isolated herself from friends and family, spending hours alone in her apartment, replaying Kevin's betrayal over and over in her mind. She thought about the years she had spent trusting him, the years he had spent pretending to be a father while secretly violating her privacy. She thought about the photos on his laptop, the folders labeled with her body parts, and the way her life had been stolen from her without her even knowing. And in the darkness of those nights, Araceli made a choice, one that would forever change the course of her life. What happened next would shock everyone who knew Araceli Kerr. The kind, driven woman they had always known was about to take a step that no one could have predicted. And when she did, there would be no turning back. It was New Year's Eve, 2020. While most people prepared to ring in the new year with hope and celebration, Araceli Kerr was preparing for something far darker. That evening, she drove to the hospital to pick up Kevin Rollins. Kevin had been recovering from his fall and was being discharged to return home. The drive to the hospital was quiet. Araceli gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles turning white as waves of anger pulsed through her. In the passenger seat on the way back, Kevin, oblivious to the storm brewing within his stepdaughter, made casual conversation. But Araceli barely heard him. To her, his voice was a constant reminder of what he had done, the betrayal that had shattered her trust and scarred her forever. The atmosphere in the car was thick with unspoken tension. Kevin, still weak from his injuries, leaned back in the seat, his voice faint and his movements sluggish. Araceli, on the other hand, was hyper-aware of every moment. Her heart pounded as she glanced at him out of the corner of her eye, barely able to contain the simmering rage beneath her calm exterior. She had spent days replaying the discovery on his laptop, the photos, the folders, the years of deceit. And now, sitting next to him in the car, all she could think about was what she had decided to do. By the time they reached Kevin's home, the evening sky had turned dark, and the neighborhood was eerily quiet. Kevin shuffled into the house, leaning on Araceli for support, completely unaware of the plan she had spent days forming. Araceli helped him settle into his favorite chair in the living room, offering him a warm smile, a mask hiding her seething anger. The man who had stolen so much from her sat comfortably in his home, vulnerable and trusting, while she moved quietly into the kitchen to prepare what would come next. In the kitchen, Araceli prepared a drink for Kevin. But this wasn't just a gesture of care for her stepfather. Araceli laced the drink with a dangerous combination of painkillers and sleeping pills, medications she had carefully collected in the days leading up to this moment. Her hands trembled slightly as she mixed the drink, but her resolve remained firm. She told herself that this was the only way, that Kevin couldn't be allowed to continue living after what he had done to her. She returned to the living room, placing the drink in front of Kevin. "This should help you relax," she said, her voice calm and steady. Kevin, unaware of the sinister intent behind her words, accepted the drink without hesitation. He took a sip, then another, as Araceli sat across from him, watching closely. Minutes passed, and the effects of the drugs began to take hold. Kevin's eyelids grew heavy, his speech slowed, and his movements became sluggish. He leaned back in his chair, mumbling incoherently as the sedatives took control of his body. As Kevin drifted further into unconsciousness, Araceli pulled out her phone and texted one of her closest confidants, Daniela Stevens. "I just dosed the hell out of him," she wrote, the chilling message a glimpse into her mindset at the time. Daniela, unaware of the full extent of Araceli's plan, didn't respond immediately. But by now, Araceli wasn't looking for advice or reassurance. She had made her decision, and there was no turning back. Hours passed, and Kevin remained slumped in his chair, completely sedated. But as the drugs began to wear off, Kevin stirred. His eyelids fluttered open, his breathing uneven as he tried to make sense of his surroundings. Araceli, who had been pacing the room, froze as she saw him begin to wake. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her mind was clear. She knew what she had to do. Kevin's groggy attempts to speak were cut short as Araceli moved quickly. She grabbed a plastic bag she had prepared earlier and approached him. Without hesitation, she slipped the bag over his head and tightened it around his neck. Kevin's movements grew frantic as he realized what was happening, his hands clawing weakly at the bag. But in his drugged state, he lacked the strength to fight back. Araceli pressed down with all her strength, her breathing heavy, her mind racing with a mix of rage and adrenaline. As Kevin's movements slowed and his body fell limp, Araceli released her grip. She stepped back, staring at the lifeless figure slumped in the chair. The man who had once been her stepfather, her mentor, her father figure, was now gone. She stood in silence, the gravity of what she had done settling over her like a heavy weight. But the silence didn't last long. She picked up her phone and sent another text to Daniela. This one was darkly tinged with sarcasm. "It's going to be weekend at Bernie's." The casual tone of the message belied the seriousness of what had just happened. A chilling glimpse into Araceli's state of mind. With Kevin's body now lifeless, Araceli knew she had to act quickly. She moved methodically, trying to clean up the scene and cover her tracks. First, she wrapped Kevin's body in a sheet, struggling with the weight as she dragged him from the living room to the garage. The effort was grueling, but Araceli pushed through, driven by a combination of fear and adrenaline. Once in the garage, she covered the body with trash bags, stacking them haphazardly to obscure the figure beneath. It was almost midnight by the time she finished. The house was eerily quiet, and Araceli sat in the dimly lit garage, staring at the pile of trash bags. The enormity of what she had done began to sink in. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and though Kevin's betrayal had driven her to this point, she couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling of dread that now consumed her. For a moment, she considered calling someone, her mother, Jaylene, or even the police, but the thought quickly passed. There was no undoing what had been done. As she returned to the house to clean up any remaining evidence, Araceli's mind raced with questions. Would anyone believe her if she told the truth about Kevin? Would they see her as a victim, or would they only see the crime she had committed? She didn't have answers, and she didn't have time to think. All she knew was that the clock was ticking, and she had to make sure no one would find out what had happened that night. The morning of New Year's Day, 2021, dawned cold and quiet in the Encinitas neighborhood where Kevin Rollins lived. Most residents were still in bed, recovering from the previous night's festivities. But one neighbor, out for an early walk, noticed something unusual in Kevin's driveway. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary pile of trash bags, nothing out of the ordinary after the holiday season. But as the neighbor walked closer, something about the way the bags were stacked seemed off. They were haphazardly arranged, some partially open, and the faint outline of something beneath them caught their eye. Uneasy, the neighbor decided to call the police. When officers arrived, they began inspecting the scene. It didn't take long for them to uncover what was hidden beneath the trash bags. Beneath the layers of plastic and discarded household items, they found the lifeless body of Kevin Rollins. The 64-year-old man who had once been a prominent figure in the community now lay crumpled in his own driveway, a sheet still partially wrapped around him. The signs of foul play were immediately apparent: bruising around his neck and the unmistakable impression of suffocation. The officers quickly secured the scene and began their investigation. They spoke with neighbors, many of whom expressed shock and confusion. Kevin was well-liked, respected, and had no known enemies, at least none that anyone was aware of. But it didn't take long for the police to turn their attention to someone closer to home: Araceli Kerr, Kevin's stepdaughter. She had been the one to pick Kevin up from the hospital the previous evening, and her behavior in the hours following his death would raise more questions than answers. When investigators contacted Araceli to inform her of Kevin's death, her reaction was strangely subdued. She expressed shock, but it felt rehearsed, almost mechanical. She told officers she had dropped Kevin off at his house the night before and left shortly after, leaving him alone to rest. She claimed to have no knowledge of what could have happened, but her demeanor, calm, almost too calm, raised suspicions among the officers. Something about her story didn't feel right. As detectives delved deeper into the case, they uncovered a series of inconsistencies in Araceli's account of the previous evening. Surveillance footage from a neighbor's security camera showed her car in Kevin's driveway far later than she had claimed to be there. In fact, the footage revealed that her car hadn't left until the early hours of New Year's morning. This directly contradicted her claim that she had only stayed for a short visit. The real breakthrough in the investigation came when detectives obtained Araceli's phone records. What they found painted a chilling picture. Text messages sent to her friend Daniela Stevens revealed details that Araceli had failed to share with investigators. In one message, sent late on New Year's Eve, Araceli wrote, "I just dosed the hell out of him." The language was blunt, unsettling, and left little room for interpretation. Other messages sent earlier in the week hinted at her growing anger toward Kevin and her plans to take action. One text read, "I don't know how to live knowing he did this," followed by, "He has to pay for this." Investigators also found an ominous text sent just hours before Kevin's body was discovered. "It's going to be weekend at Bernie's." The darkly sarcastic reference to a comedy about a dead body further implicated Araceli in the crime. The messages, combined with the surveillance footage and the physical evidence at the scene, unraveled the carefully constructed alibi Araceli had tried to maintain. When police confronted Araceli with the evidence, her calm demeanor began to crack. At first, she maintained her innocence, claiming she had no idea what had happened to Kevin. But as detectives pressed her, presenting her with the text messages and surveillance footage, her story began to falter. She became defensive, then quiet, as the weight of the evidence against her became impossible to deny. By the end of the interrogation, Araceli was no longer the composed woman she had appeared to be. She was visibly shaken, her voice trembling as she refused to answer further questions. With the evidence mounting, police made their move. On January 2, 2021, Araceli Kerr was arrested at her apartment and charged with first-degree murder. The news of her arrest sent shockwaves through the community. The kind, driven woman many had admired for her work as an interior designer was now accused of killing the man who had been a father figure to her for years. Araceli was taken into custody and held without bail, awaiting trial. As the details of the case began to emerge, the public was stunned by the complexity of the story. On one hand, there was Kevin Rollins, a beloved philanthropist with a reputation for kindness and generosity. On the other hand, there was Araceli's discovery, the photos on Kevin's laptop that had ignited her fury and driven her to commit an unthinkable act. The community was left grappling with conflicting emotions, horror at the brutal nature of the crime, and sympathy for a woman who had clearly been betrayed in one of the worst ways imaginable. In the weeks following her arrest, Araceli remained silent, refusing to give interviews or make public statements. Her defense team began preparing for what would become a high-profile trial, one that would expose the darkest aspects of both Araceli's life and Kevin's hidden secrets. But even as the legal proceedings loomed, one thing was clear. The story of Araceli Kerr and Kevin Rollins was far from over. The truth about what had happened, and why, was still unfolding. By the summer of 2023, the highly anticipated trial of Araceli Kerr was underway. The courtroom was packed with spectators, reporters, and family members, all eager to hear the details of what had become one of the most shocking cases in recent memory. On one side sat Araceli, stoic and silent, her expression unreadable as she faced the charges of first-degree murder. On the other side were prosecutors, armed with evidence that painted a chilling picture of premeditation and intent. The stage was set for a legal battle that would lay bare the darkest aspects of both the crime and the lives of those involved. The defense team opened their case with a simple but powerful argument. Araceli Kerr had not planned to kill Kevin Rollins. Her actions, they argued, were the result of an overwhelming emotional breakdown caused by Kevin's betrayal. Imagine discovering that someone you trusted, a father figure, had violated you in the most intimate and horrific way. Her defense attorney, Zachary Drake, told the jury, "The psychological toll of that kind of betrayal cannot be overstated." They described Araceli as a victim of trauma, a woman who had acted out of sheer emotional distress, unable to think rationally after uncovering the photos on Kevin's laptop. To support their argument, the defense presented text messages and testimony from Araceli's friends and family, painting a picture of a woman spiraling into despair in the days leading up to the crime. Jaylene Newman, Araceli's closest friend, took the stand and described the conversations they had after the discovery. "She was broken," Jaylene said tearfully. "She couldn't stop crying. She felt like her whole life had been a lie." Araceli's mother, Princess Yates, also testified, describing the phone call she received from her daughter on the night of the discovery. "She was hysterical," Princess said. "I've never heard her like that before. She felt destroyed." The defense argued that this emotional unraveling, combined with years of hidden tension in her relationship with Kevin, had driven Araceli to act in a moment of blind rage. But the prosecution countered with a different narrative, one that painted Araceli as a calculating and deliberate killer. They pointed to the evidence uncovered during the investigation: the cocktail of painkillers and sleeping pills she had prepared, the chilling text messages she sent to Daniela Stevens, and the surveillance footage that contradicted her original timeline. This was not a crime of passion, the lead prosecutor, Daniela Stevens, argued. This was premeditated. Araceli Kerr had days to think about what she was going to do. She mixed the drugs, she suffocated him, and she covered up the crime. This was no accident. This was murder. Prosecutors highlighted one text in particular, sent on the night of Kevin's death. "I just dosed the hell out of him." The blunt and casual tone of the message, they argued, was evidence of Araceli's clear intent to incapacitate Kevin before killing him. They also referenced her later text, "It's going to be weekend at Bernie's," as a darkly sarcastic acknowledgement of what she had done. The prosecution left no room for doubt. Araceli Kerr, they argued, had planned Kevin's death and executed her plan with chilling precision. As the trial progressed, expert witnesses were brought in to shed light on the psychological aspects of the case. Forensic psychologists testified about the psychological toll of discovering the photos Kevin had kept on his laptop. One expert described the violation as a form of psychological abuse that can leave long-lasting scars. They explained how such a discovery could destabilize a person's mental state, causing intense feelings of betrayal, anger, and helplessness. But the prosecution countered with their own experts, who argued that while the betrayal was severe, it didn't excuse murder. Many victims of similar violations feel anger, but they don't resort to taking a life, one expert stated. Araceli Kerr had the ability to seek help, to go to the authorities. Instead, she chose to take justice into her own hands. The courtroom listened in silence as the experts debated the boundaries between trauma and accountability, each side presenting their case with passion and precision. Friends and family members were also called to testify, their words providing a window into the lives of both Araceli and Kevin. Jaylene Newman and Princess Yates spoke of Araceli's emotional state, describing the overwhelming despair and anger that had consumed her after discovering Kevin's secret. But Kevin's colleagues and friends painted a different picture, describing him as a flawed but fundamentally kind man who didn't deserve to die. The conflicting testimonies created a complex portrait of the case, leaving the jury to weigh Araceli's trauma against the deliberate nature of her actions. After weeks of testimony, evidence, and emotional arguments, the case was finally handed over to the jury. 12 men and women deliberated for 3 days, sifting through the mountains of evidence and testimony that had been presented to them. The courtroom was tense as the verdict was read, the air thick with anticipation. The jury found Araceli Kerr guilty of first-degree murder. The conviction sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Some spectators felt justice had been served, while others believed the jury had failed to account for the psychological trauma Araceli had endured. Araceli herself sat motionless as the verdict was announced, her expression unreadable. She had fought to defend herself, to explain her actions, but in the end, the evidence had been too damning to overcome. At her sentencing, the judge acknowledged the complexity of the case but emphasized the premeditated nature of the crime. "What you experienced was a profound betrayal," the judge said, addressing Araceli directly. "But that does not excuse taking the law into your own hands." Araceli Kerr was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 25 years. As Araceli was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, the case left a community divided. Some saw her as a victim of unimaginable betrayal, driven to an act of desperation. Others saw her as a murderer who had crossed a line that could never be justified. But one thing was clear. The story of Araceli Kerr and Kevin Rollins would be remembered as a tragic tale of trust, betrayal, and the devastating consequences of unchecked rage. The conviction of Araceli Kerr brought an end to the legal proceedings, but for the people closest to her and Kevin Rollins, the ripple effects of their story were only beginning. Kevin's death and the revelations that emerged during the trial left his family and friends shattered, struggling to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the secrets he had kept. For years, Kevin had been seen as a pillar of the community, a philanthropist, a mentor, a man dedicated to making the world a better place. But his betrayal, as exposed through Araceli's discovery, left a dark stain on his legacy. Princess Yates, Kevin's widow and Araceli's mother, bore the brunt of the devastation. In interviews following the trial, Princess spoke of the unimaginable pain of losing both her husband and her daughter in such a tragic way. "It's like losing my entire family," she said, her voice trembling. "Kevin was my husband. I trusted him with everything, and now I can't even say his name without feeling disgusted. And Araceli, she's my baby. I know what she did was wrong, but I also know how much she was hurting. I've lost them both, and I don't know how to move forward." Friends of the family echoed similar sentiments. Many described Kevin as a kind, supportive figure who had always seemed to have everyone's best interests at heart. The revelations about the photos on his laptop were shocking to those who knew him, forcing them to question how well they truly knew the man they had admired. "I don't understand it," one longtime friend said. "He was always so good to people. How could someone like that do something so horrible? It makes you wonder what other secrets he might have been hiding." Meanwhile, Araceli's friends grappled with their own feelings of loss and confusion. Many expressed sympathy for her, describing her as a woman pushed to her breaking point by an unimaginable betrayal. Jaylene Newman, who had been Araceli's closest confidant, spoke about the guilt she felt for not being able to help her friend before it was too late. "I knew she was struggling," Jaylene said, "but I didn't know how deep it went. I didn't know she was capable of doing something like this." Araceli's actions left a lasting mark on her relationships, with some friends standing by her and others unable to forgive her for crossing the line into violence. Beyond the personal tragedies, the story of Araceli Kerr and Kevin Rollins resonated on a broader scale, highlighting the devastating psychological damage that betrayal, abuse, and manipulation can inflict. Experts who followed the case emphasized the long-term effects of such trauma, particularly when it comes from someone in a position of trust. When a trusted figure, like a parent or step-parent, violates that trust, it can have a profound and lasting impact, one psychologist explained. "It's not just about the betrayal itself. It's about the way it erodes a person's sense of safety, their ability to trust others, and even their own identity." The case also shed light on the hidden lives people lead, and how even those who seem upstanding and honorable can harbor dark secrets. Kevin Rollins was a man celebrated for his work in butterfly conservation, a respected figure in his community. But behind the facade was a man capable of violating the privacy and trust of the very person he was supposed to protect. The story serves as a sobering reminder of the complexity of human behavior and the shadows that can lurk beneath even the brightest surfaces. For many, the story of Araceli Kerr raises difficult questions about justice, accountability, and the human capacity for forgiveness. Was Araceli's act of violence a crime born of rage, or a desperate attempt to reclaim control over her life? Was Kevin's betrayal an isolated act, or part of a deeper, more troubling pattern? And most importantly, how can families and communities begin to heal after such a devastating chain of events? These are questions that remain unanswered, leaving behind a story that is both heartbreaking and deeply thought-provoking. In the end, the tragedy of Araceli Kerr and Kevin Rollins is a story of trust shattered, of secrets exposed, and of lives forever changed. It's a reminder of how the wounds inflicted by betrayal can ripple outward, leaving devastation in their wake, and how even the strongest bonds can be undone by the darkest of secrets. The story of Araceli Kerr and Kevin Rollins is not one that ends neatly. It's a story without winners, where tragedy overshadows every part of the narrative. Kevin's death and the shocking betrayal he committed left behind a fractured family, a grieving community, and a legacy forever tarnished. Araceli's life, once filled with promise and ambition, now plays out behind prison walls, her actions and the pain that drove her there haunting her every day. But more than anything, this case serves as a grim reflection of human frailty. The secrets we keep, the lengths we go to protect or destroy, and the irreversible consequences of choices made in moments of anguish. It's a cautionary tale about the weight of betrayal, the depths of trauma, and the dangers of unchecked rage. In the quiet suburban neighborhood where this story began, life has moved on. But for those who were touched by this tragedy, the scars remain, silent reminders of a story that will never truly fade. And for the rest of us, it's a story that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about trust, betrayal, and the complexity of justice. This is the story of Araceli Kerr, a story of trust broken, of justice sought, and of lives forever changed.